Nobody approached Ji-Soo at the Seoul Diamond Gala. She was the Ice Queen, a corporate fixer who moved through the room like a ghost in a black silk dress. No alliances, no small talk, and absolutely no reason for the city's elite to risk a cold shoulder. But a 7-year-old girl in a delivery vest noticed her. Clutching a thermal food bag that looked heavy enough to tip her over, the child crossed the marble floor, ignored the billionaires, and looked straight into Ji-Soo's frozen gaze. She whispered 5 words that would shatter the Ice Queen's world. "Can I sit with you?" In 30 minutes, that little girl, Eun-Ji, would hand Ji-Soo a delivery so lethal it would drag her from her high-end gallery straight into the shadows of the Jon Mafia estate. If you've ever wondered what happens when a woman who prides herself on being untouchable finally finds something worth touching, stay with us. Subscribe now, because the delivery this girl is making isn't food. It's a plea for a father's life. Ji-Soo hadn't come to this gala to play hero. She had come to close a contract. As a high-level corporate fixer, her life was built on 3 things: ironclad NDAs, offshore accounts, and an emotional distance that kept her heart as cold as the Han River in January. She dealt in luxury, high-end art, corporate restructuring, and the kind of problems that money could quietly erase. She was good at her job because she never got involved. She was better at her job because she never cared. The gala was supposed to be the victory lap. Her associate had secured the invitation through a high-profile contact, promising that the right handshake tonight would secure Ji-Soo's retirement by 35. Ji-Soo had stood in her penthouse, staring at the city lights, before sliding into a minimalist black dress with a high collar and a silver hairpiece that looked more like a weapon than jewelry. It was a dress that commanded silence before she even spoke. She walked into the ballroom expecting a paycheck. She didn't expect a Trojan horse in a blue delivery cap. Ji-Soo didn't believe in coincidences. She believed in leverage. As the girl climbed into the velvet chair beside her, the Ice Queen felt the weight of 100 curious eyes. A child in a speedy delivery, cap at a table reserved for the upper crust, was a stain on the gala's perfect choreography. "You're lost, Eun-Ji," Ji-Soo said, her voice a sharp, cool blade. She didn't look at the girl. She kept her gaze fixed on a CEO across the room, projecting an image of bored indifference. "The service entrance is 2 floors down. My business doesn't involve charity, and it certainly doesn't involve children." The girl didn't flinch. She placed the square thermal bag on the white linen tablecloth with a soft thud. "My father says you're the only one who can see the strings," Eun-Ji whispered, her voice trembling but her eyes fixed. "He says the Black Widow is pulling them. He's sleeping longer every day. His tea smells like bitter almonds, and his hands don't shake anymore. They've gone numb." Ji-Soo felt a familiar chill, but it wasn't from the girl's story. It was the mention of bitter almonds, the classic signature of cyanide derivatives, but slowed, refined, professional. Still, getting involved with the Jon Syndicate was a death sentence for a corporate career. "Your father is a powerful man. He has doctors, guards, and a fiancé," Ji-Soo replied, finally turning to face the child. "Go home, forget you saw me." She began to stand, ready to signal security, when Eun-Ji pushed the delivery bag toward her. "The delivery isn't for you. It's from him. Look inside, please." Ji-Soo hesitated. Her instinct for self-preservation screamed at her to walk away, to keep her hands clean and her reputation untouchable. But the girl's posture, regal despite the oversized vest, tripped a wire in Ji-Soo's memory. She saw a flicker of her own isolated childhood in those defiant eyes. With a sigh of practiced annoyance, Ji-Soo unzipped the bag just enough to peer inside. Expecting a bribe or a file, she found something far more visceral. Tucked beneath a cold carton of noodles was a small, amber vial containing a dark, viscous liquid and a crumpled napkin stained with a strange, metallic blue residue. Ji-Soo's breath hitched. She recognized the blue tint. It was a stabilizer used in high-grade industrial toxins, the kind that didn't just kill, but erase the evidence as it worked. This wasn't a child's imagination. It was a forensic plea. Eun-Ji reached out, her small hand hovering near Ji-Soo's silk sleeve. He's the lion of Seoul, but he's trapped in his own den. If I go back alone, she'll know. The Ice Queen looked at the vial, then at the girl, then at the glittering, fake world of the ballroom. The corporate contracts suddenly felt like paper toys. The dilemma was gone, replaced by a cold, familiar calculation. She could mind her business and watch a kingdom fall, or she could step into the fire and see if she was as untouchable as she claimed. Ji-Soo zipped the bag shut and stood up, her face a mask of stone once more. "Stay close," she commanded, "and lose the hat, we're leaving." The transition from the neon-lit gala to the shadowed gates of the Jon estate felt like crossing into a different century. Ji-Soo didn't arrive as a savior. She arrived as a shark. Using a high-level corporate shell company and a forged recommendation from a silent partner, she rebranded herself within hours. She wasn't a fixer tonight. She was a strategic restructuring consultant brought in to audit the syndicate's legitimate holdings before the upcoming merger. The estate was a fortress of glass and dark stone, perched on a hill overlooking Seoul like a gargoyle. As the heavy iron gates hummed shut behind her sleek black sedan, Ji-Soo felt the atmospheric pressure change. The air here was thick with the scent of pine and something metallic, the smell of old power and new blood. "Remember," Ji-Soo whispered to Eun-Ji, who sat low in the back seat, her delivery vest replaced by a tailored navy coat. "You are invisible. I am the one they watch. You are just a daughter coming home from a private lesson." Eun-Ji nodded, her small face pale but set in a mask of regal determination that mirrored Ji-Soo's own. They were met in the grand foyer by a wall of men in suits that cost more than most people made in a year, but the real threat was the silence. It was the silence of a house holding its breath. Ji-Soo was led past Ming vases and security monitors into the primary study, where the Lion of Seoul awaited. Jon Siwon sat behind a desk of carved obsidian. To the casual observer, he was the picture of authority, bespoke three-piece suit, silver hair swept back, a heavy gold ring glinting on his hand. But Ji-Soo's practiced eye saw the fissures. His skin had a translucent, grayish hue, and his breathing was shallow. A rhythmic struggle, he was trying to hide behind a mask of stoicism. "The board mentioned your efficiency, Ms. Park," Siwon said. His voice was a gravelly rasp, lacking the thunderous resonance that had once commanded the city's underworld. He tried to reach for a glass of tea on his desk, but his fingers twitched, missing the rim by a fraction of an inch. Ji-Soo stepped forward, her heels clicking rhythmically on the polished wood. She didn't look at the tea. She looked directly into his eyes, seeing the flicker of a trapped man behind the mahogany desk. "I don't just audit books, Mr. Jon," she said, her voice a cool, steady anchor in the room. "I identify liabilities, some are on paper, others are closer to home." For a heartbeat, the air in the room turned to ice. Siwon's gaze sharpened, a flash of the old predator returning as he processed the hidden meaning in her words. He looked at Eun-Ji, standing quietly by the door, and then back to the woman who had dared to enter his den. "Then I suggest you start your audit immediately," Siwon replied, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous silk. "Before the liabilities become permanent." Ji-Soo inclined her head. The threshold was crossed. She was no longer untouchable. She was inside the lion's mouth, and the Black Widow was already watching from the shadows of the hallway. The silence in the hallway didn't last. It was replaced by the soft, rhythmic rustle of silk against the polished floor, a sound that announced Seoyeon before she even entered the room. When she stepped into the light of the study, the atmosphere shifted from the heavy, stagnant air of a sick room to something sharp and electric. Seoyeon was a masterclass in visual deception. She wore a modern, hanbok-inspired gown of deep charcoal, the high collar framing a face of porcelain perfection. She didn't walk, she glided, her movements possessing the fluid grace of a dancer and the calculated precision of a sniper. "Siwon, darling, you really must rest," Seoyeon said, her voice a melodic silk that masked the command beneath it. She didn't look at Ji-Soo immediately. Instead, she moved to the desk, her slender fingers lingering on Siwon's shoulder in a gesture that looked like affection but felt to Ji-Soo like a claim of ownership. The doctors were very clear about overexertion. Only then did she turn her gaze toward Ji-Soo. Her eyes weren't cold like the Ice Queen. They were warm, dark, and terrifyingly observant. They didn't just see Ji-Soo, they dissected her, looking for the frayed thread in her corporate armor. "And you must be the auditor," Seo-yeon continued, her smile widening just enough to show the edge of her teeth. "A strategic restructuring consultant. A very modern title for someone standing in such an old-fashioned house." Ji-Soo kept her spine rigid, her expression a mirror of professional detachment. "Efficiency doesn't care about the age of the house, Ms. Seo-yeon, only its stability." "Stability is a delicate thing," Seo-yeon replied, picking up the glass of tea Siwon had failed to reach. She swirled the amber liquid, the light catching the faint, oily sheen on the surface that Ji-Soo knew shouldn't be there. One wrong move, outside interference, and the whole structure can crumble. She offered the glass to Siwon with a grace that was nauseatingly beautiful. As he took a small, shaky sip, Seo-yeon's eyes locked onto Ji-Soo's. In that moment, the Ice Queen realized her mistake. She had expected a greedy socialite. She had found a lethal architect. Seo-yeon wasn't just poisoning the man, she was curating his demise with the same care Ji-Soo used to curate an art gallery. "I hope you find what you're looking for in our records, Ms. Park," Seo-yeon whispered, her voice dropping to a low, intimate vibrato as she stepped closer, the scent of bitter almonds and expensive perfume trailing behind her. "But be careful. In this house, people who look too closely often find things they weren't meant to survive." The warning wasn't a threat, it was a promise. As Seo-yeon led the fallen lion toward his quarters, Ji-Soo realized she wasn't just navigating a corporate takeover. She was in a cage with a predator who had already scented her blood. The infiltration of the Jon estate was a game of shadows, and Ji-Soo knew that in a house full of guards, the smallest shadow was the most dangerous. While Seo-yeon's attention was fixed on the Ice Queen and her endless stacks of financial ledgers, Eun-Ji moved through the corridors like a ghost. To the security detail, she was just a grieving daughter wandering the halls of her father's crumbling empire. They didn't see the way she tracked the servants' movements, or how she timed the exact moment the tea was prepared in the private kitchen. 5 minutes, Eun-Ji whispered, appearing suddenly in the doorway of the library where Ji-Soo was feigning an audit. The girl's face was pale, but her hands were steady as she held a small thermos of identical, safe tea Ji-Soo had prepared in the guest wing. Ji-Soo didn't look up from her tablet. "The cameras in the West Hall have a 40-second blind spot during the shift change. If you miss it, we're both dead. Do you understand?" Eun-Ji nodded once, a sharp, adult gesture that made Ji-Soo's chest tighten. The girl vanished again, slipping into the service corridor just as the clock chimed the hour. Ji-Soo stepped out into the hallway, her heels clicking with deliberate, distracting authority. She intercepted the head maid carrying the silver tray toward Siwon's quarters. "A moment," Ji-Soo commanded, her voice like frost. She held up a series of documents. "These signatures from the chairman's private accounts are inconsistent. I need you to verify the filing dates immediately." The maid hesitated, the tray trembling. "But the chairman's tea, Ms. Park." Seo-yeon was very specific about the timing. "The chairman's finances are my specific concern," Ji-Soo countered, stepping into the woman's personal space, forcing her to turn away from the tray to look at the tablet. In that heartbeat of distraction, a small blue and yellow blur flickered in the periphery. Eun-Ji moved with the silent precision of a girl who had spent her life hiding in plain sight. With one hand, she lifted the poisoned porcelain cup. With the other, she replaced it with the harmless lookalike. The swap was seamless, a delivery executed with more stakes than any the girl had ever made for her family's business. By the time the maid turned back, flustered and apologetic, Eun-Ji was gone. Ji-Soo watched the tray disappear into the lion's den, her heart hammering against her ribs for the first time in years. She had spent a decade avoiding the messiness of human connection, yet here she was, anchored to a 7-year-old girl by a thread of shared treason. As she retreated to the library, she found Eun-Ji waiting in the shadows, clutching the original, poisoned cup. The girl looked up, her regal mask finally cracking with a sliver of terror. "We did it," Eun-Ji breathed. We survived the first round, Ji-Soo corrected, her voice low and lethal. She took the cup, the faint scent of bitter almonds rising to meet her. But the Black Widow doesn't like to lose her prey. She'll notice he isn't fatting, and that's when the real hunt begins. The moon hung low over Seoul, casting long, skeletal shadows across the obsidian floors of the library. Ji-Soo sat among the towering shelves, the glow of her laptop the only shield against the darkness. She was cataloging the toxins, not the accounts, when the heavy oak door creaked. Jon Siwon stepped into the room, his gait steadier than it had been that morning, but his frame still looked brittle under his silk robe. He didn't call for the lights. He moved to the window, staring out at the city he had spent 40 years conquering. "The tea tasted different tonight," he said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to pull at the very air. "Less like metal, more like nothing." Ji-Soo closed her laptop, the click echoing like a gunshot. "Sometimes nothing is the safest thing you can consume, Mr. Jon." He turned, the moonlight catching the deep lines of exhaustion carved into his face. For the first time, the Lion of Seoul looked less like a predator and more like a man who had realized his throne was made of glass. "I built this house to be a sanctuary for my daughter. I surrounded it with the most loyal men money could buy. I chose a partner who possessed the grace I lacked." He let out a dry, hacking laugh. "And yet, I can feel the life leaking out of me. Every breath is a negotiation I'm losing." Ji-Soo stood, her heels silent on the thick Persian rug. She approached him, stopping just outside the circle of his personal space. "You're being liquidated," she said, using the cold language of her trade to mask the sudden ache of empathy. "Systematically and quietly." Siwon leaned against the window frame, his hand trembling as he gripped the ledge. "I know the betrayal is here. I can smell it in the halls. I see it in the way the guards look past me instead of at me." He looked at Ji-Soo, his eyes searching hers with a desperate, raw honesty. "But I cannot see the face of the one holding the blade. My mind plays tricks on me, Ms. Park. Is it my captains, my rivals, or is it the very shadows of this room?" The vulnerability in his voice was a crack in the Ice Queen's armor. She knew the name. She had seen the Black Widow swirl the venom with a smile. But telling him now, while he was still weak, would trigger a reflex of denial or a premature war he wasn't ready to fight. "The face doesn't matter yet," Ji-Soo whispered, her voice softening for the first time. "What matters is that you aren't fighting alone anymore. A delivery was made, Mr. Jon, and I've accepted the contract." Siwon reached out, his numb fingers brushing her silk sleeve. It wasn't a gesture of power, but a plea for a lifeline. In the midnight shadows of the library, the untouchable fixer and the fallen king stood in a fragile alliance, unaware that behind the heavy velvet curtains, the rustle of charcoal silk was listening. The storm broke over Seoul with a violence that mirrored the chaos inside the estate. Thunder rumbled, heavy and low, shaking the glass walls as the power grid flickered once, twice, and then died. The mansion was plunged into a suffocating, absolute black. In that sudden void, the professional silence of the house was replaced by the rhythmic thwip-thwip of suppressed firearms and the heavy boots of men who weren't there to guard. Seo-yeon had realized the lion wasn't dying fast enough. She had moved her timeline up from weeks to minutes. "Eun-Ji," Ji-Soo hissed into the darkness of the library. She didn't wait for a reply. She moved by instinct, her fingers brushing the cold spines of books until they caught on the fabric of a small coat. She pulled the girl into the narrow gap behind a mahogany partition just as the library doors were kicked open. Red laser sights danced across the room like blood-colored fireflies. Through the rain-streaked windows, flashes of lightning illuminated the intruders, men in tactical gear, moving with a lethal, synchronized grace. These weren't street thugs, they were a cleanup crew. "Stay low, don't breathe," Ji-Soo whispered, her lips grazing the girl's ear. She reached into her clutch, discarding the useless tablet and pulling out a heavy, steel-plated fountain pen, a gift from a client that functioned as a tactical glassbreaker and a desperate, short-range blade. It was a pathetic defense against submachine guns, but Ji-Soo had spent a career turning pathetic into leverage. A man stepped past their hiding spot, the smell of wet pavement and gun oil trailing after him. Ji-Soo watched the silhouette of his barrel sweep the room. She wasn't an assassin, but she was a fixer. She knew that every system, no matter how reinforced, had a single point of failure. As a flash of lightning turned the world white, she saw Seo-yeon standing in the doorway, a silhouette of charcoal silk framed by the storm. The Black Widow wasn't hiding anymore. She held a radio, her voice calm and melodic even over the thunder. "Find the girl. Eliminate the consultant. The chairman stays for the final toast." Eun-Ji's small hand tightened on Ji-Soo's arm, her fingernails digging into the silk. The Ice Queen felt a surge of something hot and unfamiliar, a protective rage that burned through her cold calculation. She wasn't just protecting a client's interest anymore. She was protecting a child from a monster she had underestimated. "We have to move," Ji-Soo breathed, her voice a low, lethal anchor. "We're going to the wine cellar. It's the only room with a reinforced door." "But my father," Eun-Ji started, her voice breaking. "He's the lion," Ji-Soo countered, pulling the girl toward the servants' passage. "Right now, we have to make sure he has something left to fight for." They slipped into the shadows of the back hallway, two ghosts navigating a labyrinth of steel and betrayal, while behind them, the hunters began to close the circle. The amber vial was no longer a secret. It was a death warrant. While the storm outside began to break, Ji-Soo signaled for the extraction team. She had quietly moved into the estate's perimeter under the guise of logistics auditors. They didn't bring ledgers. They brought a medical-grade neutralizing agent, a fast-acting antagonist to the neurotoxin that had been leaching the life from Jon Siwon's veins. As the clear fluid was administered, the transformation was visceral. Within the hour, the gray pallor of Siwon's skin was replaced by a flush of returning circulation. The tremors that had turned his hands into useless weights stilled, replaced by a grip that could once again crush bone. He sat in his obsidian chair, not as a dying man, but as a judge. "The audit is complete," Siwon said, his voice no longer a rasp, but a low, terrifying rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. Seo-yeon stood in the center of the room, her pearl-handled pistol lying useless on the carpet, kicked away by a captain who had realized which way the wind was blowing. Her charcoal silk was rumpled, the Black Widow's grace finally unraveling into the desperate twitching of a trapped insect. Around her, the men who had prepared to swear fealty to her new regime now stood like statues of ice, their eyes fixed on the floor. "You thought the poison had reached my brain," Siwon continued, standing up with a fluid power that made the guards take an involuntary step back. "You thought I was too blind to see the beauty of the blade because I loved the woman holding it." He didn't scream. The Lion of Seoul didn't need to. He simply looked at his most trusted captain, the one who had hesitated the longest before the toast. "Clear the house. Every man who looked away while my daughter was forced to play courier. Remove them. Every account Seo-yeon touched. Freeze them. And as for my fiancé..." He paused, his gaze flickering to Eun-Ji, who stood at Ji-Soo's side. The girl's eyes were wide, but she didn't look away from the justice being meted out. She had earned this moment. "Take her to the North Wharf," Siwon commanded, his voice cold and final. "Let her see the horizon one last time before she disappears from my city forever." As the guards dragged a screaming Seo-yeon from the hall, the heavy silence of the estate was replaced by the efficient sounds of a purge. Traitors were disarmed, locks were changed, and the Black Widow's influence was scrubbed from the stone walls. Siwon turned to Ji-Soo, the fire in his eyes softening just a fraction. He looked at the Ice Queen, bloodied, tired but standing tall, and then at his daughter. For the first time in years, the Jon estate felt like a home instead of a tomb. The lion had awakened, and his pride was finally safe. The rain had slowed to a rhythmic pulse against the windows of the grand foyer, the frantic energy of the purge settling into a heavy, watchful peace. Ji-Soo stood by the massive oak doors, her silhouette sharp against the marble. She had already called her car. Her phone was buzzing with frantic messages from her firm, contracts to sign, acquisitions to finalize, a life of untouchable luxury waiting for her back in the glass towers of Gangnam. She adjusted the torn cuff of her black dress, her expression returning to the practiced mask of the Ice Queen. The audit was over. The liability had been neutralized. In her world, this was the moment you walked away before the bill for emotional labor came due. Ms. Park. Ji-Soo stopped, her hand hovering over the heavy brass handle. She didn't turn around. The extraction team has the forensic data, Mr. Jon. Your accounts are secure, and the non-disclosure agreements are already in your inbox. My work here is finished. Is it? Siwon's voice was closer now, lacking the predatory edge of the boardroom. He stood a few paces behind her, Eun-Ji's small hand tucked firmly into his. The lion looked tired, but his eyes were clear, fixed on the woman who had traded her reputation for his life. You saved a kingdom tonight, Ji-Soo, but you're leaving a child who finally found a teacher. Eun-Ji stepped forward, her yellow delivery vest discarded, revealing the girl underneath who no longer had to hide. She didn't plead. She simply looked at Ji-Soo with the same regal defiance they had shared in the shadows of the library. You said we were a team, the girl whispered. You said stay close. Ji-Soo looked out at the wet pavement of the driveway, at the black sedan waiting to take her back to her solitary gallery and her sterile, profitable life. For years, she had viewed connections as anchors, things that dragged you down into the messiness of other people's wars. But as she looked at the bruise on Eun-Ji's arm and the steady strength in Siwon's gaze, the silence of her penthouse felt suddenly, deafeningly cold. The Ice Queen reached up and unpinned the last silver fragment of her hairpiece, letting it drop to the marble floor with a soft chime. The car can wait, Ji-Soo said, her voice low but certain. She turned back toward the heart of the house, her heels clicking a new rhythm, one that didn't sound like a departure. She wasn't a fixer for hire anymore. She was a woman who had finally found a fire worth standing in. As the heavy doors remained shut, the three of them walked back into the warmth of the estate, leaving the cold world of untouchable business behind for a family they were no longer willing to lose.